Welcome to the Investor Coaching Show. Here's your host, Paul Winkler.
Yeah, and back. I'm Paul Winkler. Investor Coaching Show, Super Talk 99.7 WTN. I just want to do a shout out real quick, guys. Just thank you to the folks over at Trevecca University. They had me come and speak to the kids and some of the staff, some professors this past Thursday, and it was just so much fun. Oh my goodness. I just love those people over there. So I really, really enjoyed that. And just talking, it was fun. You're talking about business and talking about just success in general, living a life I'm thinking how building a life/career without regret was the title. And I went all over the place on that one. I think I'll probably end up getting that on the website because they sent me a copy of it and I may get that out there. I'll talk to the powers that be. So I'm not even in charge of my own website. My illusions of my level of control are always overblown. And, we're just talking just a second ago about fears and things like that. Somebody had actually sent me something else. It was like, looking at this thing in American, it's not looking good. Pay attention, blah, blah, blah. And, it was a friend of mine just sent me a message this morning. And I says, it was so interesting. I watched this video they sent me and I says, it didn't take this person long to make a claim that was really super misleading. And I don't even remember what the claim was. There were a couple things that were just half-truths. They weren't quite right. And my comment regarding all this stuff is just, I really long for the days when you had like Walter Cronkite or you didn't have news going on all day long. It was, you got home and if you watched news, it was 6 o'clock at night and then it was repeated again at 10 o'clock at night, in my house, where I grew up. And even then, just swung in and it was a short period of time and then you swung out and there was just a few things that were really important. There wasn't all kinds of commentary on what to think about this, but so much of the news is where things are going, what's going to happen as a result of this. Hey, we've got this person in as a guest and here's what they think is going to happen. And I sit there and just go, oh, this is ridiculous. They have no clue what is coming next because you have to predict human behavior. That's a problem. When we see something happen, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't just, hey, this event takes place, and then all of a sudden, this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. It's not the domino effect. Domino, you got one domino falls, it hits the next one, it hits the next one, it hits the next one, and then it's a predictable outcome because you see one thing fall after another. The problem with trying to predict the future is you're having to predict how people are going to respond to the news. And they're going to respond in their best interest as best as they can. So what'll happen is something takes place and then all of a sudden, maybe a company steps in or maybe a bank comes in. It's like, you go look over at Europe and you say, well, this happened with this particular bank in Europe and everything's going to fall apart. This domino is going to hit this one and this is going to be contagion and it's all going to fall apart. But voila, the news comes out and another bank buys them. Or let's say that the government changes the fee on the FDIC insurance. And that could happen. We're talking about banking issues and we say, well, what could happen? You could actually have the government raise the fees for banks on FDIC. So the money's not coming out of taxpayers. It's indirectly affecting everybody. Because if banks have to pay more for FDIC insurance, then what happens is we all get lower interest rates on our bank deposits. So it can indirectly affect. But what we forget about is that there is always something that comes in and changes the dynamic of whatever event is taking place, and then we end up with a totally different result. So unlike the days when we had Walter Cronkite telling us for just a short period of time what the news was, and that's the way it was, instead of that, now you have, what do you think is going to happen? Where are things going to go? And as humans, we crave this prediction about the future and what's coming next because it's convoluted. But what we can do is we can make up a story that fills the void of what's going to happen next. We can prepare for it. You know, if I'm worried about the future, if I can just make up a story as to where things are going to go from here, then I can do something to prepare and protect myself. But the problem is we make up stories that are so awful and we put ourselves into a panic state. And then we end up doing is taking action that actually hurts us rather than helps us. And the very act of predicting the unpredictable really is ridiculous because we're lying to ourselves. We're making up something. And it doesn't help when somebody misinterprets what's actually going on. And I remember at the very beginning of the video, this guy doing this video on how it's really bad for America. This is what he said it from the very beginning, to his credit. I'm not a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, he said. And I was like, listen to that part. But we listened to that. We listened to the disclaimer at the very beginning. And then what we do is we listen with bated breath for everything else that comes out, forgetting that he says, I don't really know what I'm talking about.
So why is he on air? Why is he on air?
It was a video. It was a video. There are tons of them. Anybody can do it.
Right.
It wasn't even on air. This was not on. This was just a video that somebody had sent to me. And so, it was, so on YouTube or whatever.
Intern then.
I think it was TikTok.
I think
it was TikTok.
Oh, you know how I feel about TikTok.
Well,
misinformation.
Yeah, there's misinformation everywhere. I mean, you don't have to. Good grief, you can go to, you can go to sanctioned sites and you have misinformation. People used to believe everything because they sort of could believe a lot of things.
Exactly.
Now you can't. And, what happens, we get this spirit of fear, and that's just not where we belong. It's not where we belong. Worried about what's going to happen next. Recognize that everybody is out there trying to make their lives as best as good as they can. They're doing the best that they can. And it was like I was talking to Pamela, and I was talking to Matt, and we were all just blabbing about what are companies doing right now. Well, one of the things that companies are doing right now is they're laying off people. I forgot to talk about that in a second, because the layoffs it's interesting. It's very split on what's going out there. You're hearing a lot about layoffs, right? But you're not hearing necessarily the other side of it, which is something I have talked about. There are a lot of hiring going on too. There's a lot of hiring going on. And there was something about that. I'll talk a little bit about that and how it fits into all of this in just a second. You're listening to the Investor Coaching Show, Super Talk 99.7 WT, and I am Paul Winkler. I'll be back right after this. All right. Back here on the Investor Coaching Show, Paul Winkler. So, talking about, what companies do to adapt to circumstances. Now, number one, of course, companies can try to increase sales. They can do that if they can. It just blows my mind right now. It blows my mind. I was sending a message to my folks today, and I says, I was looking at something, because we were talking about technology companies earlier and just, what's going on in that particular area, and people going to technology stocks for safety, which is just mind-boggling to me. Really? Technology? Yeah, that's safe. Yeah, that money market. Oh, that's really safe. That's tremendous.
I mean, the generation that's going on right now.
But if you look at the S&P 500, the 500 biggest companies,
mm-hmm.
and if you take those 500 companies, I think I'm diversified. I own the S&P 500. And I'm like, no, you're not.
Exactly.
Because over 15% of your money is in two stocks. That's what it is right now. Apple and Microsoft added up is like 15% of your money. So 0.6% of the companies account for 15% of the money.
Paul, you don't have to come at me.
No, I'm not trying to come at
just
you.
a messenger.
I'm coming at my audience. Listen, this is an accident waiting to happen.
You know how you just looked at me. I'm like, I'm just throwing
That's
it out
because you're there. That's because you're there. Okay, I'll stop looking. Okay, so if we look at what companies are doing right now, because, you look at one of the highest returning areas of the market in the first quarter of the year was actually it was the highest, is like Europe, Australia, Far East. I mean, wow. I mean, when's the last time we talked about international stocks doing anything great? Large international stocks anyway. But if we look at what companies are doing, they're laying off people is one of the things that they're doing. They can increase their sales, but if they can't increase their sales, they'll reduce their expenses. And there was one article is in the journal was talking about still desperately seeking workers. And they were talking about with all the tech layoffs we keep hearing about, and by the way, that's partially why tech stocks came back up, is because they got rid of a lot of expenses. And that's one of the ways that you get your stock price to go up, is you get rid of a lot of expenses. With all the tech layoffs, they said it didn't do much to dent the job market. The recent roiling of banks might not either. The job growth has remained remarkably strong despite the Federal Reserve sharply increasing interest rates over the past year, crumbling of housing, and several rounds of headline-grabbing layoffs from companies such as Google parent, Alphabet, Meta Platforms, and Amazon. And what's happening is that we've got demand from employers that are sucking up all of the layoffs because the economy is still hot. You can go and try to increase interest rates, and that's what they've been talking about, is increasing interest rates. But it says that, moreover, demand from employers aiming to hire doesn't appear to have slackened. An index of overall U.S. job openings from job listing site Indeed was, as of last Friday, actually a bit above where it was before the Silicon Valley Bank troubles hit. Though down from the highs it reached in late 2021, it is still a third higher than it was before the pandemic. And, the degree to which the banking sector's troubles might eventually reduce this demand for workers is uncertain. We don't really know how it's going to play out. But, that said, Goldman Sachs economists point out that the lending standards had already tightened due to the recession concerns, even before SVB collapsed. So, further tightening might only represent an incremental change from the credit conditions because they were already. And that's what I mean when I talk about who's following who, the Fed or the interest rates, because the Fed is just a small part of the bond market. And they said the banking troubles might lower the temperature on the job market, making it easier for companies with openings to hire workers and taking some pressure off of wage growth. But they won't freeze it. And I got into a conversation with a young guy, when I was speaking at Trevecca, and I did two different things. I taught in front of a large group, and then I taught a class, one of their classes. And this young guy comes up to me afterward, and he was from another country. And this young man got the economics of the world economy much better than it just blew my mind. Here's a young kid coming up and he's going, what about this? And he's asking me this and this and this. And I looked at him and I go, you rock. You really get this. I was blown away at how this young guy got what was going on. But what he was talking about, which is something I've talked about here many times, he was talking about the immigration policies. He says it's insane. The immigration, just letting people, stream across the border is insane when you have people like him that are highly skilled, highly educated, have to jump through hoop after hoop to come to a country that they would love to go to because their country is messed up. And in my mind, it is really the cure for a lot of these problems that we're having. We have to raise interest rates because we've got to slow the economy down. Because if we don't slow the economy down, people buy too much stuff. If they buy too much stuff, then you have to hire people that aren't available to be hired. And if they're not available to be hired, their wages keep going up. And if their wages keep going up, that stokes inflation. And if that stokes inflation, we got to raise interest rates even more. It is a horrible cycle that keeps going on. And hence the reason that when you hear Jerome Powell talking about, we got this interest rate, we can raise interest rates. And as I said before, it's a blunt instrument to try to slow things down, when really what we've got to do is we got to lean on the legislators to do something different. Now, this is not an investing thing right here. Because remember, companies will do whatever they got to do to get to profitability. We just saw it with technology companies. They laid off a ton of people, and they get back to profitability. So if you're worrying from an investing standpoint about what I'm talking about, don't worry from an investing standpoint. This is not an investing diatribe. This is, can we somehow get it that immigration is not bad? It's not terrible. It's actually quite helpful, especially when you can't get... There was a poll. Did you see this poll in the Wall Street Journal? People are making hay about it, but this whole poll in the Wall Street Journal was talking about people and having children. And they're talking about, their attitudes towards children. They're talking about their attitudes toward religion. They're talking about their attitudes toward, what was it? It was children, religion, and patriotism was the third thing that they talked about.
I've seen it.
Did you see that?
Yes.
I mean...
Actually, my little brother asked me about it.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
30% of 2023 respondents said having children was very important versus 59% in 1998. 38% in 2023 said patriotism is important versus 70% in 1998. 43% said marriage is very important, and that was not counted in the previous surveys. The only value that increased in importance in respondents' minds from 1998 to 2023 was money. I mean, the least important of all of those things. I mean, literally what I started my whole, and it may sound funny with the financial guy saying that.
I literally just told you, Paul, I'm going to the bathroom.
But the reality of it is that we look at, and this is how I started my speech. I said, over at Trevecca, I said, values, what we value. If we really think about it, money is just a tool to express what we value. I said, you could have a life of success, is how I started it off. You could be totally broke and have a life of success. There are some people that go out and do missions work, some people that are pastors, some people that do charity work. And the reality of it is they're tremendously successful and they may be tremendously broke. And the reality of it is it does not matter. It's not that big of a deal. Yes, this is a show about finances, a show about being a more successful investor and all of that. And that is really what I talk about all the time. But if we look at these things and we say, well, how do we fix this? Well, this is why I diversify internationally. I diversify all around the world, all different size companies. Companies are going to do whatever they've got to do to get back to profitability. That's what they're going to do. And I always say that I wear two hats. My one hat is as a proud American that says, hey, I want this country to work well. And the other side is to make you a successful investor. And they seem like they should be one and the same, but they're not. Because you can have markets go up tremendously well during recessions. Stock markets can go crazy. 2009 was a horrible recession year. 2010 was a horrible recession year. And yet the stock market skyrocketed during both years. So recognize that this is not, again, talking about investing. It's just talking about the things that we ought to be focusing on to make the other side of life a little bit better. And when we look around the world, we see a lot of companies dealing with the same kind of garbage that we are. And maybe even a little bit worse. And you look at it and say, well, what are their markets, what are their markets doing? Man, they're fine. We go back through history and they have had returns that are very, very similar. Go back to the 1950s till now, large British stocks, large U.S. stocks, about the same exact return. Small international stocks, small U.S. stocks, about, very similar returns. Value stocks, very similar returns. This is not an investing thing, but it's just the reality of it is we need to, as just an investing public and a voting public, just kind of know something about some of these things. Because money isn't everything. Quality of life is another part of it. And this show has always been more than money. It's just the way I look at it. It has always been more than that. But, purpose is something that we can express with no money. I often will have people write down a bucket list. Or what are the things you want to do to live a life without regret? And then say, okay, now why do you want to do those things? Well, because beauty is my value. Connection is my value. Maybe love is my value. Well, you can have love, you can have beauty, you can have connection, broke. You can get all those things with no money. And so often we get caught up in just one thing. But this stuff goes in cycles too. I'm going to leave this segment with an optimistic note because I think this stuff goes in cycles. I remember how despondent we were as a nation in the 70s and how we were going through such a lull. I mean, you look back at history books, what a lull we were going through in the 1930s and just, the issues that we were dealing with and the fear that we were dealing with. That was a scary period in history. You look back through history and you go, oh, it's never been like this, Paul. I'm like going, can you imagine living through the Depression, seeing lines like we saw? Can you imagine being in Europe where you got a guy like Hitler going around and he's just deciding to, let's just eradicate a race. Let's just do it. Yeah, for the fun of it. This is really great. And can you imagine being there? I was there watching Jimmy Carter telling us that we were running out of oil, the very thing that we all heated our houses with. We used to drive our cars. We used to fuel the factories in our country. We're running out of the thing that is making our economy what it is. That's scary stuff. We've never been there. We've never been there before. Never been through this before. It's always something different. And it goes through cycles. That's why I'm an eternal optimist. I've been called Pollyanna before. Yes, I have been. But I think it's rational to be optimistic.